Hello and welcome to Edie Extra, the new home for all of Edie's special audio features, building on our long-running Sustainability Uncovered podcast with one-on-one interviews, site visits, analysis, panels and more.
Hello and welcome along to the Edie Extra podcast channel from Edie, the place for special audio features about the hottest topics in environmental sustainability. You're listening to the voice of Sidhi Mittal, Edie's senior reporter. This episode is being recorded live at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, in southwest London. It's the UK's biggest botanical gardens at more than 320 acres and more than 50,000 living plants. I'm here specifically to see the new Carbon Garden, a new permanent installation which reveals the hidden worlds of carbon underground. It opened in July 2025 thanks to Biffa Award funding. The garden features a circular layout with a large pavilion at its center, designed to look like a giant mushroom. Its shape draws from the underground fungal networks that support plant life. Surrounding the pavilion are bands of flowers in red, blue, and orange, arranged to reflect the famous climate stripes from Reading University, which illustrate rising global temperatures. There are also several information boards throughout the space explaining how carbon is stored in plants and soil and the vital role nature plays in capturing and storing carbon. But here to explain the garden in more technical terms are my great guests from the Q team, Lara Michael, the Senior Project Manager, and Joe Richomme, Garden Supervisor at RBGQ. Welcome guys. What is the Carbon Garden? How did the idea come about? Can we start with you, Lara?
So the garden brings the carbon cycle to life. It was conceived by our head of garden design, Richard Wilford, in 2021, and it started on site in February this year.
Really exciting. The Carbon Garden describes itself as whole life net zero. Can you unpack what that actually means in practice?
One of the key drivers in order to make sure that this is net zero, or achieving net zero, was to make sure that we limited the amount of carbon disturbance or soil disturbance of the existing site. The other thing that we really wanted to do is make sure that we used very low embodied materials in terms of making the new installation of the fungal fruit that you described in the middle. We really wanted to practice caring for embodied carbon in action. So the base of the pavilion structure is made of granite stone, and it's slightly submerged to form the structure. And the reason why we chose the strength of stone is that we could limit the amount of concrete that you'd normally put into a foundation for a structure like that. So it's just laid on 50 mil of blinding, and then the ballast is laid on top, and that's recycled gravels that we had already in Kew Gardens, and then the stone goes up to a limited steel ring, and then there's a glulam larch, the large glulam structure above it. Larch we chose because that's a European timber, so it was really important to make sure we were considering how much carbon is used in transporting materials here. And on the top of the pavilion is a composite panel, a natural composite panel canopy. It's formed with flax and resin. It's a world first, I think. I don't think it's ever been used in as a roofing material. It's a kind of natural a sort of nature-based solution alternative to fiberglass, and we're really hoping that people in the construction industry are going to be able to see how our pavilion fares, because it enable them to make more sustainable choices when they're looking at their materials going forward.
Horticulturally as well, we're experimenting with different sustainable materials. So some concrete had to be taken out of what was here before, the site that was here before, and that concrete was crushed and mixed with sharp sand, and we've actually used that as a substrate in the dry garden, a free draining substrate to grow our plants in. So those plants that need that kind of free draining soil type to grow in, we've reused that material in the dry garden.
That's really cool. Just talking a bit more about the designing aspects of it. Joe, the design blends science, symbolism, and storytelling, juxtaposing lush, herbaceous waters with dry future climate plants. What was the thinking behind that contrast?
I think there's a lot we're trying to say with this garden. We're trying to bring to life the carbon cycle, this natural cycle, but also trying to show visitors how human activities are having an impact on that cycle and how that's affecting our climate. And then we're also trying to give people things that they can do to sort of help mitigate some of the impacts of that changing climate. So there's a lot going on in this garden. So having these very different zones spread throughout helps us to tell that whole story of carbon, to really get every facet in there.
And can you run me through the thinking behind choosing the different plants? They represent climate resilience. What was the thinking behind that? Any surprising species included?
So when we're thinking about plants as this kind of key interface between atmospheric carbon and terrestrial carbon, plants are photosynthesizing, taking carbon in from the atmosphere and kind of locking it up in their biomass. You've got to think about the longevity of those plants, particularly things like trees, for instance. If you're planting a woody tree now that might live for 50, 100 years, there's no sense, in a way, planting something that's going to start struggling in the heat and the dry in 20 or 30 years' time. And we are seeing projections in that climate, which means that London is going to be hotter and drier in the summer. So we've done a lot of research here at Kew, not just on trees, but all sorts of plants. We're thinking about what we're planting so that it is going to be really resilient to those changing conditions, that it will be thriving in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. So we're choosing species that come from more Mediterranean regions that already are experiencing those conditions, which then will be able to adapt better to them.
And were there any particular challenges in balancing beauty and biodiversity with features like rain garden, bioswale?
Personally, I don't think so. I think a lot of the plants that we've used here actually are still really beautiful. At the moment, they're a bit small. We've just planted this garden, things are still growing in, but you'll see it kind of start to blossom over the next couple of months. And actually, lots of things are just starting to come into their own now, particularly on the climate stripes at the back. We've got these really nice big bands of colour that are really kind of eye-catching already. And then in the dry garden as well, part of it will be us highlighting the interesting things about these plants. I think they actually do look really great already, but highlighting the interesting features that make them resilient, the silvery leaves or the hairs on the leaves that make them less susceptible to drought. If you tell these stories, our visitors will be engaged with them in that way.
Thanks, Joe. And Lara, we've spoken a bit about how nature can be a powerful ally in storing carbon and the role that it plays in carbon sequestration. How do you think gardens like this can shape how people think about climate action, especially in urban settings?
I think the thing about this is botanical gardens, there's been lots of research that shows that they can actually bring the temperature down in urban areas by at least 5 degrees. So ensuring that all our urban our cities are planned with lots of green gardens, a bit like green corridors right across, will actually help lower urban temperature. The future prediction is that a large proportion of our populations will be living in urban environments, so it's really, really important that we use nature corridors or these green corridors to be able to counterbalance that warming climate, and particularly in the urban area.
And how does this reflect Kew's wider ambition to be climate positive by 2030?
So the key thing that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast about 2021, which is when this garden was conceived, that's when we produced our landscape succession plan, which our leading scientists and head of trees, Kevin Martin, was working on, which is developing and research into these climate resilient trees. It's also when we produced our sustainability plan, so our aim is to be carbon neutral by 2030, and we're on that trajectory. And then obviously as a botanical gardens, serving the public, it is absolutely our duty to make sure that all the plants and trees survive here for hundreds and hundreds of years to come, which is what Joe was talking about, but also a duty to educate and demonstrate these kind of calls to action to our visitors.
We're speaking about community use and education through the garden. How are you hoping schools or local groups will use this space?
So I think all children learn about photosynthesis at school. So we put some kind of fun, engaging things. There's some binoculars with an animation of the carbon cycle. So immediately when a younger visitor arrives at their garden, there's going to be something that kind of makes sense to them. And then from the story can lead on from there to tell them more and more about how important carbon is. It's in humans, it's in plants, it's in fungi, it's in soils. And the other thing I think that's really going to be really important is that carbon has actually had some really bad press. We talk about the burning of fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases and how this is all dangerous and bad, and it really is. But this garden is to offer hope and to remind people of how important it is in life. And we're hoping that school children and our visitors will come here to kind of celebrate carbon, actually.
Thanks, Lara. Looking ahead, could the Carbon Garden serve as a model for other gardens, cities, or organizations tackling climate change?
I think this is, as far as we know, this is the first carbon garden in the world that aims to tell this whole story, and certainly particular bits of it I think could be used as templates elsewhere. Planting in a way that we choose the plants that are going to be thriving, that's going to be really important for sustainability going forwards. We don't want to be planting the same plants that take an enormous amount of extra resource, loads of water applied, all this kind of stuff. We want to be planting plants that actually will cope with those hotter, drier conditions. We're also thinking slightly more, I suppose, ecologically, you could say. So other parts of the garden, we've got a long grass meadow, we've got a wildflower meadow. Those kind of habitats are really key for locking up carbon, but also tackling another great kind of environmental crisis that we're facing, which is the biodiversity crisis. So designing gardens with these elements in them as well, I think is really something that we can kind of show can be done in a very beautiful way, and in a garden that doesn't just have to be that. And then also we've created some bits. We've created log piles, ways that we can feed fungi in the garden as well. So log piles are providing habitat and food, if you will, for fungi, which are really key for locking carbon up in the soils. So things like that, I think, can be used as a template. They're not new, but using them in a garden setting like this hopefully will set a trend.
Would you like to add to that, Lara?
Yeah, so what you'll find around the garden are these green circular signs that have play your part in them with a QR code. So all our visitors can come here and they can take away the list of plants, the climate resilient plants that we've planted, and they can take away the list of trees. And the other thing that I think is really exciting alongside this is we're looking at the water cycle alongside the carbon cycle. And because of a botanical garden, conserving water is really, really important. But we really need the water, and it's very interlinked. So this garden is allowing us to do a pilot study on an irrigation system that uses soil moisture probes and is connected to weather stations. And we're going to gather the data over the coming period to see how these plants are surviving, how much water they need, and when there's enough moisture in the soil, the irrigation should turn off. So for a long-term plan, in terms of making sure we can conserve water, this is a test bed that we could then look at rolling out in the rest of our gardens.
That's really interesting. And now just looking beyond the Carbon Garden for a second, are there any other initiatives in place to encourage visitors to engage with what they're going to learn here at the Carbon Garden beyond their visit?
Lots of people, if they've got a front garden, they're tending to tarmac them so they can park their cars or whatever. When you get the sudden downpours of rain after the droughts, all the water that lands on those roads on those driveways are just going off into stormwater. Whereas if they put something like a rain garden in, that slows the water down and it puts the water back in the soil, which is where we need it to keep the whole cycle going. So there's little things, interventions like that avid visitors who want to try things out at home will take away, and it's visually stimulating to see them.
Well, there you have it, the story of the Carbon Garden here at Kew Gardens in one podcast episode. Lara and Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to show me around and to come on the Edie Extra podcast. For everyone listening, I hope this has given a flavor of the garden and some inspiration for your own nature and climate storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to Edie Extra wherever you get your podcasts. We are on SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, and YouTube. For today's episode, it's a goodbye from me. Goodbye.